What's he building in there? What's he building in there? We have a right to know.
Welcome, everyone, to this week's episode of Reframing the Narrative, episode 35. And we have a really interesting discussion planned for you today. We are going to be talking about what is real. And there's so many dimensions that conversation will have and should have. But before I go any further, Jake, good to see you as always, representing the Montreal Expos in the Great White North that I just returned from in Toronto. Although I did go to a Blue Jays game, I think most Canadians would be happy to see any sports team with their logo or former logo. So, Jake, why don't you kick this off? I know you've got a lot of thoughts about this topic and what that's all about.
All right, this is going to be a real barn burner, eh? And just to be clear, we're talking about what is real, not what is Israel. Um, as you can see, that's a topic we could touch on as well if you're watching the video version of this discussion. But it's good to be back, and yeah, I wanted to quote a real big influence on me to kind of get this whole thing kicked off in the context of the world we're facing with technological breakthroughs and advancements. And of course, whether that's really like the pinnacle of technological advancement where we are at the moment is probably a topic for our next discussion with our next guest. So we'll be looking forward to that. But somebody who had a big influence on me was not really addressing anything related to what is real or not. But Dr. Herbert M. Shelton was a pioneer in just natural hygiene, was what he called it. And he's a big influence on me in opening my eyes to what health is and how to nurture and sustain health with natural methods. So, no more on Herbert Shelton, but I love this quote and I'll try to tie it into the topic today. So, he said, "Humankind is subject to the law of inertia. Men and women do not progress, they are pulled along. The few drive the many along behind the chariot of progress. Every hygienist," because he was a natural hygienist, "every hygienist should get into the chariot as a driver." So I will pull that out and say, well, we'll expand beyond every hygienist and say every human should get out from wherever you are and get in that chariot as a driver. And the context really is the trend that we're dealing with at the moment, which you can just see by just scrolling around. I happen to be on Twixter recently. I'm not there very often, but I got an ad for Gemini, which is the generative AI that Google is pushing right now. And I'll insert that clip here because it was just showing what can be done with this powerful tool. And the the take really is anything coming from your screen could and maybe even likely is or was generated by a computer and by an AI program these days. So therefore, what are we looking at? What is real in the world, and how do we approach it? Because it's here. And so talking about, the being driven along, to Herbert Shelton's point, most people are being driven along, and it's like a tide. We're going to be impacted by this, and we are already. So what do we do about it?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to comment on there because you're right, and Herbert was right in that quote that most people really do go along to get along. And, I just think about even during the scamdemic in 2020 and 2021, a perfect example is I would say that the median of the people during that tomfoolery were may not have really believed in everything that was on TV or weren't completely scared by the intentionally frightening news reels talking about people dying or getting sick or whatever, or more importantly, wearing the face diapers. And I would say that the majority of people were really just happy to put on a face diaper and not cause controversy, even if they didn't have explicit fear, because there's this worry that a lot of people have of standing out from the crowd in a way that gets them isolated. And why not just go along with what everybody else is doing and just be good enough? And I can say that, beyond political situations like that, and that truly was a political situation, I see this even in my day-to-day work life, where you or someone like myself tries to present solutions to people that would really improve their situation and put them in a better place in life. However, there's this natural resistance to doing something different and to maybe uprooting from the people or systems that they're familiar with. And it's really hard to, even if you know in your heart of hearts that there's something better for them, there's this tendency to pull back towards the norm, towards the middle of the curve, and just be part of good enough. And I think that's really a place where a lot of people find themselves. And the truth of the matter is, a lot of people put themselves into different types of jobs or roles or situations to stay kind of in the pack. And by doing that, they actually limit themselves in terms of what they could contribute to the world. And by creating meaningful contributions to the world, also potentially having a much bigger and deeper and richer life, both from a quality of life perspective as well as an actual enrichment perspective. And I just see that people are just more apt to stay complacent to what feels comfortable when there's a bigger, broader world out there available to them, that if they just put that next foot forward in whatever way that ends up meaning for them, that they could be enjoying. But it's like, oh, well, then I'd have to go into the unknown. And maybe that's where this discussion develops to, is the unknown, the fear of the unknown. And, my first example of wearing face diapers, well, what happens if now I'm the person without one? And what are authorities? What are my friends? What are my family going to say? Or, take that to all the logical conclusions. But I think a lot of times it's people limiting themselves because of the fear of the unknown, instead of looking at it from, like, most people are by default bred into a scarcity mindset. And so they say, what if there's not enough out there for me if I take this step, versus what am I missing out on that is out there, and taking that step towards it, and taking that bold step to the unknown. And it's truly the people in our society, in our world, who take that step and lead by example, lead from the front, that I think that this quote is really applicable to, and really trying to push beyond just the natural hygienist. It's, what are people doing to really innovate and go beyond just the normal cube or box that they were born or raised into, or chose because it was easy.
There's so much in there that I could respond to. But as you were kind of wrapping up those thoughts about the what ifs, I experienced a Tony Robbins training a while back. It's almost a year now. And he went through an exercise that really drove home the notion of what if, from it kind of flipped it on its head. And what it involved was visualizing, what if you continued on your trajectory? What if you continued to not take action? Or what if, let's say what if you eat a bag of potato chips every single day? You know, just visualize yourself 15 years from now and lying in a bed attached to a bunch of tubes and maybe breaking your scale or anything that you could just take to its logical conclusion of having not taken accountability and responsibility for putting yourself on a better path and enriching your life and fulfilling your potential. And that was actually the most cathartic part of the whole thing for me. And I won't get into why, but just there's so many things to me about the gift of life that we have to honor all our talents and abilities and in our discernment and our insight, all the things that we have. And if we practice those, we can elevate things to such a different level. But if we ignore them and say, what if, like, what if, even things like people are concerned about what if you do something and what people will say. And in the context of like face diapers and the malarkey of 2020, 2021, people would comment about somebody's behavior and they say, well, what if you don't do whatever? What would people say or what will happen to your job? But, well, what if everybody just said, no, I'm not going to do this? And then it would never have gotten legs and we could have driven that chariot. But as Shelton said, people are just they're so susceptible to inertia and they'll just go along to get along. And to me, what I see and what's always driven me as one of my biggest motivations is the lost potential when you just go along to get along, when you just do what's easy and you take the path of least resistance, you're, yeah, sure, you might run into something and get knocked back on your ass and you might fall, you might fail. How many great business people, serial entrepreneurs, inventors, people who achieved big and great things, how many of them never failed? They always inevitably talk about their failures and how it made them better because they learn from them. And it's the same thing like as a former athlete, like some of my best successes were my failures in a way because I learned from them. And so if you're just trying to avoid failure or you're avoiding friction, then you're just going to go along with that inertia. You're never going to get it anywhere. You're not going to make forward Canadian progress.
Absolutely. And there's so much there also to comment on. And I just to circle back to the point of failure, you bring up a really good point there. And it reminds me of an interview I watched recently with a famous, now he's a sales coach and personal development coach, but he started his career knocking door to door sales and learning quickly what would or would not work. There's a guy named Brian Tracy who is very popular in the sales world and in many different elements of sales. But he did an interview within the past year or so where he was with his family and they were talking about lessons learned. And he really brought forward this idea of fail fast because everyone who is a true innovator or entrepreneur who's made it, they actually started in the bottom 10 to 20% and failed a lot. But to your point, they learned as they failed and they figured out what they could be doing better. And his recommendation to people in general was fail as fast as you can and learn from that so you grow and you become better. It's, as you say, to avoid the pain of uncertainty and to avoid discomfort is limiting your progress. And I would actually also comment too on that idea of you had basically talked about human potential in the insurance world. They call that human life value, and they put a number to that, and that's both uh, looked at from an insurability standpoint as well as they also look at your potential earnings in the future. But human life value goes so much beyond even those aspects. And a book that's inspired me recently well, there's a series of them, but the first one to really change my thinking about human life value and what we can contribute to our world is this book called Killing Sacred Cows 2.0 is the most recent version by Garrett Gunderson. And he really challenges the idea of, do we have to scrimp and save and live this life of sacrifice and scarcity, or can we live now and live in alignment with the values that we have and the things that we really want to do with our time? And he makes a really strong case that your life is now, and you can live it now versus waiting to some future far off state when you may be healthy enough to enjoy it and you may have the money you think you're going to have. But that is all to say that even switching gears out of the finance world and sales, it's really worth everyone thinking about, are you really doing what you want to be doing, or are you doing it for the purpose of fiat debt notes? And is that even real, what you're working towards, and how much of that is really going to be there for you when it comes to inflation and it comes to taxes? I mean, what are you really spending your time on? And to circle back even harder on things we've been talking about in this podcast, where are you paying your attention, and how is that contributing to the life that you want and the life that you want to see created for others?
Really good points. And speaking of just going into some kind of profession for the Federal Reserve notes, I have noticed, and I'm not the first that's had this insight, but if you think of what student loans and that associated debt due to graduates from, let's say, medical school, or whatever trade they may be in, but medical school is a big one because it's expensive and it takes a long time. And when those graduates are fresh out of their residency and starting their practice, can they really afford to devote themselves to healing if they have insights that may go against what they've been taught as far as just um, fixing with external forces, remedies, and medicine the way it's practiced under the Rockefeller structure? Do they really have that freedom? Let's say you graduate, you learn a whole lot about anatomy and physiology, you learn about drugs and their reactions, and you think, well, I really need that medical degree because I need a career, but that's not how I want to practice. I'd rather go in and advise people on health, but there's nothing to sell in that. And no hospital is going to give me a contract. How many people are actually going to go ahead and do that? That's because not only is there's that weight of the expectation of society and the way things have been practiced, but then there's the additional debt. And I mean, it's not good to be in debt. So yeah, it's just there's so many factors that push people to just go along, and there's all that lost potential. And I think we would have a much more interesting society if people didn't have that kind of pressure just to, between the horns of the day to make those Federal Reserve notes, if they could spend their time on productive tasks rather than doing what's expected or helping some kind of a cause that's not theirs to get a little further down that field.
Yeah, absolutely. And, just getting to the point of the allopathic medicine system that we're surrounded by, the recent graduates or even people well into their career, not only are they not given the education they need to really think through whether the system they've been given makes sense at all, but as you say, they leave their education with a pile of debt that they've got to figure out how to pay down and eventually live that life that they were promised. I'm sure it depends on your particular type of practice. Not everyone's a heart surgeon or brain surgeon and making the highest rate. So presumably someone could be paying on that 10, 20, 30 years before they finally live the good life. And what motivation would they really have to question whether vaccines are harmful or not, especially when the pharma rep was there giving them free lunches and perks and handouts while they were in their residency. Um, who's going to really stand up and question when they've got this pile of debt and this promise of finally getting that payback financially that they put all this time and effort into? And it's easy for me to sit on this side of the screen and talk about some of the people that we've observed in the quote unquote alternative medicine community, and how they're by many respects shilling some of these supplements or snake oil cures. But I think the counterpoint to that, and not that those quote unquote cures are necessarily good or right, but does come back down to the pressure everyone has to amass some amount of fiat to support their lives. And so it really does beg the question, how do we as a society find better solutions for healing and health that aren't somehow linked to the financial beast system? And I don't know that there's a really good answer, but perhaps it starts with circling back to that quote of leading from the front. If each individual chooses that they will take responsibility for their health and, making good decisions, eating right, getting rest, letting the body do what it needs to do, maybe enough people do that, then it becomes a movement. But certainly you're not going to find that from the people who practice medicine as a profession, because on some way, shape, or form, they're handcuffed to the monetary system, and there's really no good way out of it.
Yeah, and their livelihood is tied into it. It's like the difference between somebody who takes pictures and enjoys taking snapshots or whatever they're doing. Maybe there's somebody that's really good at photography that takes beautiful portraits of their significant other or collaborators, and they never make any money from it. They're free to do whatever they want, and there's no commercial expectations. But like for me, um, that's how I make my living, and uh, the client's right. There's a difference there, and so I can see how, in if that is your profession and it's the health profession and that's what you've invested in, there's certain parameters that you're going to be constrained by. And even in something like academia is another good example. If you've gotten all the way through an advanced degree, master's or a PhD program, and then you're teaching, you're on tenure track. Perhaps there's the incentive of that and the sabbaticals involved when you're on a tenure track. If you're a astrophysicist, something like that, are you going to stick your neck out there and say Einstein married his cousin twice and E equals MC squared is relativity is questionable, and go into that? Probably not, because you're going to be ostracized and you're not going to remain on your tenure track if you even have a job at all. So there's so many pressures, but uh, we started out this discussion talking about what is real, and we haven't really gotten into that. Although we've had a really fascinating discussion about authenticity in another sense, and that's just being true to your authentic, I'd say, potential in your calling. And what we're getting at here is the pressures from society and the financial structure that we're under are wasting a lot of potential because there's such a strong pull, and it's a very compelling pull when you at the end of the month or beginning of the month you got to pay those bills, and you haven't done some kind of commercial activity, whether it's working for the man or working for yourself, to make that money. Then you, as the great George W. Bush said, you might not have food on your family.
And you're working hard to put food on your family.
Yeah, great quote there. GW and his flubs. Um, I'm just gonna park that for now because I could spend another half an hour making fun of the Bush family and especially Barbara Bush, the first lady. But I will turn right from that discussion because as tempting as it is, because I think it's important for us to talk about what's real, and I want to piggyback on that idea of academia because so many people commonly think, well, if X were true, then we would have heard about it from our trusted institutions, in particular, things like challenging relativity and whether the ether truly does exist and things of that nature. And even, I was inspired recently reading Agent's article about tuberculosis and how many of us have been raised with the idea that it was some bacteria and at least people from my generation have seen the movie Tombstone and can picture Val Kilmer spitting up blood and becoming pale and also being drunk and coming up with really cool saloon scenes. But um there's so many things that we've been taught as settled science and fact, and that comes from academia and all those pressures that you were alluding to. And I think about people who are really digging for the truth and looking at things like tuberculosis and how it was very likely just strongly linked to a really rotten and adulterated food supply and toxins all around. And just as many of us in the alternative community know that it all comes down to the terrain and what your body is dealing with in terms of toxicity on a daily basis that really have to do with your health. And of course, you have to supply it with the right nutrients. But all that being said, just think about someone trying to challenge what the true nature of tuberculosis was. Why would they ever do that? They have no incentive. In fact, they have pressure for the opposite. And that really just opens that can of worms about what really is real. Well, if tuberculosis isn't real and relativity isn't real, if we're not really living on a spinning ball, I mean, this ball of yarn can continue to unravel, and it really challenges us to think about the nature of reality and who's been giving that reality to us and what was their motivation.
And when it comes down to it, all of these are really just like even mathematics is not really a law, it's a way of explaining certain phenomena. And science is as well, and what you're saying, like relativity and um, the germ paradigm, it's just ways of explaining things. And so another term for ways of explaining is stories. And we've gotten into that, and somehow our podcast title has something to do with stories that we're told. Yeah, it's the N word, narrative. And so we're getting at the crux of it is really we cling to these stories. We're told a lot of stories. We want to believe stories we're told. And how many times were you told stories as a youngin growing up, and then you learned something that was contrary to those stories, and it was almost shattered your identity. And Santa Claus might be one, but there could be other ones. I don't think I ever really believed in the Tooth Fairy because the Tooth Fairy always came somehow when my mom was still up, and I think I caught her one time. But there's so many things that we somehow as humans we feel compelled to tie our worth or our identity together with these stories. They're just stories. That's it. And just imagine how liberating it would be if we economically were free to, and I'm not being like a communist utopianist here, but if we didn't have that pressure to just pay those bills or save up for the day that may never come, just imagine all the creativity that people could explore. and it's not for everybody. So sure, there would be certain roles that people would just be comfortable performing without becoming a leader or sticking their neck out. But what if the entire paradigm and the environment was more supportive? It just became more supportive to where you didn't have to feel like you're putting yourself out there, risking anything, or really becoming super uncomfortable. It would be just, uh, yeah, I think things would go in a more positive direction. But just one more point before I send it back to you was, I think it's probably impossible for people to full time devote themselves to doing things outside of the paradigms that we have and the way things operate. But if everyone could just give themselves permission to pursue things a little bit part time, we could prove to ourselves as individuals and as small communities that other potential possibilities can be achieved. And one example would just be like backyard gardening, things like that. You know, you don't have to be a farmer, but you can achieve community gardens, backyard gardens, that sort of thing. You could plant milkweed and help the monarch butterflies migrate through your community if you're on their path, or you could do other things to just really move things in a nicer direction. And it doesn't have to be your occupation.
Yeah, totally agreed. And I think the way to bring the beast system down, if everyone chose to do these small little acts, is really death by a thousand cuts. And it's everyone choosing individually to make their contribution. And that could be something, as you say, as simple as creating a way to grow your own food, for example, or it could be raising awareness of certain subjects and pushing the dialogue forward in some capacity, planting seeds, asking questions to people who aren't potentially tuned into a various aspect of truth, and getting them to start their own journey, whether they may realize it or not. Putting that kernel somewhere in their mind to germinate over time, I think, is also equally as important. But it really does, in going back to the point I made earlier today, it really does go back down to everyone individually deciding which mound they want to not necessarily die on, but where do they want to take their stand and what's important to them. And that's going to look different for everyone. But the the important part is just doing something. And going back to the question of what is reality and what is real, I think about the probably number one trap, although I guess it's potentially morphed into also your phone or your computer, but certainly the biggest trap out there to suck away productivity is the tell-lie vision, because it offers you an easy place to spend hours and be complacent and have narratives fed to you, and to sort of turn off your brain, because the reality that we are surrounded by can be complex and challenging, and it is very tempting oftentimes to turn on the boob tube and let reality be fed to you for 2-3 hours or more. And look, we're all guilty of it. It's an easy thing to do, but it's worth bringing back up every now and then, just to remind people that it really is a trap. And if you could take all those hours that you gave to the tell-lie vision and have contributed that to something else, what would that something else look like? What else could you have already accomplished in your life? And I say that to myself. This is me pointing the finger back at myself, and it's worth reflection. But certainly that box in your room, whatever that box is giving you a very curated version of reality. And it's all sponsored by the very institutions we were just talking about, and those institutions driven by people with their motivations to create that fiat in their accounts to get that debt monkey off of their back. So really, I would just challenge our listeners to think about when you do make that choice to sit in front of the box, what story, getting back to your point, Jake, is it feeding you? And how is that story contributing to your life? And how could you be creating your own story?
That ties in really well to a thought I had as you were speaking just now, and that's contributing to your own story. Maybe even if we're doing something on a computer and creating in a way with the aid of something like an AI program, generative AI, something like that. Even if we're doing that, we, in, I think it comes down to consumption, passive versus doing something. So maybe we've gotten in the habit of doing everything online, and that's not the ideal thing to do. But in the sense that you're actively involved, and even if it's a prompt, and this is like lowest common denominator here, I'm not advocating for it, but I'm kind of playing my own devil's advocate here by saying maybe, and maybe I'll even pose that question to you. Do you think that's better than actually like sitting around creating prompts and making AI art? Maybe that's more stimulating and more of a productive use of your time and your intellectual energy than just turning on Netflix and consuming. I'm not really sure, so I'll ask you that. But I think it really does kind of come down to are you just passively consuming, which is even worse than treading water. You almost be speaking of that tide that pushes everyone along. You're almost being pushed back downstream. But if you're actively doing something to stay afloat and go upstream, then that's more desirable. And I read something recently that was really thought provoking. And it must have been on Substack, and I'm sorry to the author for not remembering exactly who it was, but it really reminded me of the days when we didn't have our phones and we wouldn't fill the in between moments, like even something like, of course, there's the bathroom breaks and things like that, but um, things like riding the subway, riding the bus, even crossing the street, people are still tethered to their devices. There were so many moments where you might have not had your thoughts and your space filled with what's coming in, this constant input and infotainment on a certain level, and you are allowed to be alone with your thoughts and develop them. I've been doing laps in the swimming pool, just looking at that black line on the bottom of the pool. And I had a thought that came to me, and it was so good. I had to get out. As soon as I hit the wall, I had to get out and write it down in a notebook because I was going to forget it. Or songwriters will say, yeah, it just came to me. And so getting like some great song just came to somebody and they just in a fit of creativity or inspiration, really they went with it. And just think of like those moments if they're really gone, and that's probably one of the greatest sources of creativity and really developing who we are can be. Then that, getting back to the loss of potential, that is one of the greatest losses of potential in the world that we're in. And just when you have a free moment, even people, I noticed it when the when smartphones first came out, and it was it was it was actually like devastating to see couples on dates and they're face to face and they're both on their phones. Now it's so common, but when the phones first came out, I noticed that, and it was just saddening to see. But that's what we do now out of habit. We just reach for the phone. Oh, somebody texted me. Oh, I wonder what's going on. I'll check this site or that. And doom scrolling has taken over that use, that expenditure of energy and creative attention that I think we naturally need to foster.
Yeah, and I think it really comes down to the distinction between being a consumer and a creator. And I will give credit where it's due that that's part of the inspiration I got from Garrett Gunderson and his writing, but it's applicable in so many elements of our life. And you're right that just taking it a step further than what I had said a little bit ago about the TV, it's the same idea for having the Black Mirror device in front of you and letting that suck your attention down into it. And it's an interesting observation that Brian from Demon Erasers had made a comment somewhat recently about the black screen and the scrying that happens with that. But the point he made that I thought was really interesting is even that gesture of looking down at your phone is sort of a way of bowing or, giving it your reverence. And I think that that's appropriate to some level that, we're paying our attention to this, we're consuming whatever it's beaming out, and that we're also bowing to it on some level. It's really something to consider that perhaps some of these devices and habits we've been fed go much further beyond just our physical world, that maybe there's the unseen world that's also involved here as well. And I think that that's certainly true. If you look at, just you brought up musical inspiration, and certainly I'm not saying this is true for all music, but there are those artists who are well documented as having at least attempted to contact the spirit world or, direct communication in some form. And um, I think it was even, if I'm remembering correctly, the Stairway to Heaven song by Led Zeppelin, where Robert Plant and Jimmy Page had talked about, I think in this case, it was Robert Plant, about those words literally coming to him. And it was like his hand was moving on the paper, and he looked at it later and didn't half understand what was written down. I think there is a lot to be said for good and bad inspiration, and maybe some of that comes down to, are you a creator or a consumer? Are you consuming what's being given to you? Are the inspirations coming to you coming from a good place? And that just goes back to your comment about discernment, about whether it's good inspiration or not. But to your larger point, there are many time traps out there that would just have you consume and not be inspired at all. And those are equally as nefarious as something that maybe is inspiring you in the wrong way if you're asking the wrong voices to whisper in your ear. And I think that comes down to each of us kind of understanding where we stand in this world and what we're letting inspire us and where we're paying our attention, going back to a common theme.
Really good points, and about the duality of inspiration, and I think it comes down to personal practice in a way. I think of one of my, it's probably pretty dark in a way, but I think it's a brilliant song. It's called the Killing Moon Echo and the Bunnymen, and the songwriter, the lead singer of Echo and the Bunnymen, Ian McCulloch, basically said, yeah, that song came to me in a dream.
I remember thinking that God must have woken me up with those words, because it wasn't a dreamt them. I just woke up and they were there.
And he claims it's the greatest song ever written. He would, wouldn't he? But maybe he had a collaborator there, right? Some other inspiration. I don't know. But it is a brilliant song and very thought-provoking. And I think we're getting at something here, which is really it's a constant theme in our discussions with each other and with our guests, is really when you discern something, when something comes to your attention, to put it in a New Jersey kind of way, what are you going to do about it? And so that's really what we're confronted with the dawning of generative AI and videos that just videos and images, things coming through the screen that will be presented in certain ways, whether they have an advisory notice or they're just pawned off as reality. We are at the point where you can never tell what is coming through the screen is real or not. And it's not a new story. I mean, people believe that things in photographs back in the day, over 100 years ago, photography goes back to the 1850s or 60s, maybe 1840s actually, but I think it was refined by the 1860s. It was more common. So we're talking 175 years almost for photography, and people were questioning the reality that they saw in those, even though it was obvious, like very black and white, vanilla sky kind of stuff. What is real? And so that's the question now is, so if you're aware of this, then how do you approach it? Do you end up consuming it? Do you let it consume yourself? Or do you accept that this is what we have at the moment and do authentic things in your life to kind of offset that? That's really the takeaway that I have at the moment. And I meant to mention this at the very beginning of our discussion as far as what inspired me to bring this up as a point of conversation with us. And it was, it just blew my mind. So I'm on a forum of photographers and videographers. It's on Facebook. A post that was right in the middle of my feed was a guy talking about not being able to coordinate an appointment with the real estate agent. Either the agent was, her time was limited and she wasn't available, or he couldn't make it at the same time she was available. Whatever it was, they had decided they were going to do kind of like her walking and introducing his property, and then he would cut to this video of the property. Well, she wasn't there. He wasn't there with her. And he was able to take a few still photos that either she supplied or he might have even gotten them online and put together using snippets of her voice that were also online. He didn't have to reach out to her and say, I need examples of your voice. I need 10 headshots of you. I need pictures of you on family vacation so I get you with your hair in certain ways, whatever. He just grabbed what was available and he created a script about the property. And the end result is a camera looking at this real estate agent who's walking in the actual property in front of the property down a pathway towards the camera. The camera's moving back. And she's saying, I'd like to introduce you to 1060 West Addison. It's this great property. You might find the Chicago Cubs playing there. It was in her voice and it looked just like her. And he sent it to her. And there was no discussion about, well, that's not me. She was like, that's cool. That's a cool video. What? So we're at this is where we are now. But this is done in a kind of contractual relationship between this videographer and the agent, where they had an understanding that they were going to make a video. Who's to say that somebody could just go out and use the assets online that we've all shared on Facebook or other social media? For the most part, we've all shared, and then make a video of us doing something or saying something absolutely that we wouldn't agree with being shared out there. So the implications are just all over the place with this kind of technology. So that was really the impetus for me proposing that we talk about this. It's just, we're literally there where the agent could say, yeah, well, we don't have to do a makeup session because AI did such a good job. It's insane.
Yeah, and we really are at the point where any video or photograph can be questioned, but I think that in our history, we weren't so far from that anyway. And sure, technology has advanced, or at least it's been revealed. It may have existed before, and that's its own discussion. But I don't think the basic idea of us having to use our God-given brains and discernment to determine whether what we're being shown or told makes good sense. And I think about all the nonsense stories from the old world and these great structures that were supposedly constructed by horse and buggy people who
with
were,
chisels.
yeah, exactly, who were living in the ultimate state of scarcity and barely, making their ends meet. And here they are building these grand monuments and grand buildings. I saw an example of that firsthand when I was on my recent trip to Toronto, and we just happened to be passing through a park area that was close to where they had their World's Fairs. And a lot of our viewers who've gone down the World's Fair rabbit hole will already be familiar with the nonsensical stories associated with all of those. But I looked at one particular building as we were riding past it that is a government center, just grand architecture, and really it just hit me. Like I sort of giggled, and I thought to myself, yeah, they built this just so that the government bureaucrats would have a nice place to sit. Like there's just stories that don't make any sense. And I'll just give another plug, and Agent's probably used to it by now, but I know that he has intention in the future to dig deeper into history beyond the Civil War and the Revolutionary War, the so-called Revolutionary War. And a lot of those details don't add up. And I just think that history really is a lie agreed upon, and that kind of circling back to the idea of AI, that's really no different. In anything that we see, we have to ask ourselves, does this make sense in the context of what I know about the situation or the world? So sure, AI can be a very useful tool and it can save time for people, but it also can create a false reality. But I'd argue a false reality was given to us the moment we were born, and it was our job to determine what really was true and what is true, what really happened. I mean, the challenge is not any different. It's just the complexity of the challenge has changed a bit.
I really love what you just said there because it's kind of it it drives home the idea that okay, this is just another iteration of unreality, even though it's like I described with that real estate video, it's startling and it's insane, as I said, but it's not something that just came out of nothing. There's a continuum of this deception, and this is just a different face on that deception. And like you said, it's also a tool at the same time, and we just will be pulled along to a certain degree by this inexorable tide. And so, like a lot of the information that we have come to confront, I think we're in a good place not to be freaked out by it, because when we look at it, it's just another form of deception. We can remind ourselves that, well, there have always been ways to get back to authenticity.
Yeah, and I think just wrapping up this week's conversation, it going back to discernment, where we're paying our attention, all that is really important. But I just want to close out on your last comment about being pulled along with the tide. I think it's incumbent upon all of us to, instead of being pulled along, to lead the tide and not be part of consuming that narrative or that image or that reality and creating our own thing in some way and becoming creators and not consumers. And that's the challenge that I would put out to our listeners. Just if you reflect a little bit on how much are you creating and how much are you consuming, and could you change that balance and change your life for the better. That's where I'd leave this week's discussion.
And I'd just maybe go back to the thing I brought up about allowing those in between moments to just filter through as well, and see how you feel. Just let those settle in. Be alone with yourself and practice that, because it's very tempting to just fill those in between moments and what we feel as maybe uncertainty or voids in our lives. So I also make that a challenge for myself. So yeah, I always make it my guiding principle. When I become aware of a problem, if I don't address it, then I'm the idiot. So yeah, that's my challenge for myself, as well as my my encouragement to our listeners.
Hear, hear. And until next week, I would just say, really take a hard look at what's real and what can be real in your life, and create a new reality if you don't like the one you're in now.
You just have to flood a country's public square with enough raw sewage. You just have to raise enough questions, spread enough dirt, plant enough conspiracy theorizing that citizens no longer know what to believe.